Imagine a country that somehow doubled the size of its entire economy, crashed its extreme wealth inequality by a staggering 20 points, and achieved 99% youth literacy.
Right, and doing all of that without building a single massive manufacturing sector.
Exactly. I mean, you are looking at a society that completely rewired its geographic and social DNA in just a few decades. Yet it remains almost entirely at the mercy of the dirt beneath its feet.
Yeah, it is a phenomenal paradox.
Yeah. Today we are looking at the economic miracle and, well, the terrifying structural fragility of modern Bolivia. Welcome to this custom deep dive. If you were joining us, you know the drill.
We take a mountain of complex source material and extract the absolute most vital insights.
Right, to give you the ultimate shortcut to being profoundly well-informed. And today's source is it's a comprehensive, multidimensional data report.
For a really dense 15-page report, actually.
Yeah, tracking Bolivia's national development, all the way from 1960 to 2023. The cover itself is this very clean, white academic style with a map outline of Bolivia and these minimalist icons.
And it sets the tone perfectly because it covers 6 decades of World Bank data. We are talking macroeconomic policy, population shifts, health outcomes, environment, and the grittier realities of institutional governance.
So our objective today is to really dissect this transformation. We need to understand how a young, highly rural agrarian population transformed into an urbanized, service-driven economy.
But more importantly, we are going to isolate the specific bottlenecks, those deep-rooted systemic hurdles.
The ones that are currently preventing the country from making that final leap into becoming a high-income nation.
Right, because when we analyze national development, we usually expect a standard linear progression.
Agrarian society, then an industrial revolution, and finally a service-based economy.
Exactly. But the data we were unpacking today shows a nation that effectively skipped a step. They sprinted toward modernity while leaving critical structural foundations entirely unbuilt.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand the sheer scale of this economic shift, you cannot start by looking at GDP or trade deficits.
No, you really have to start with a human being.
Right, you have to look at the physical makeup of the society itself. And the demographic data from this 60-year period is completely wild.
The visual of the age pyramid on page 2 of the report is just striking. If you look at 1960, the youth population, so children aged 0 to 14, they constituted a massive 40.5% of the total population.
Just pause and visualize that for a second. 4 out of every 10 people you see walking down the street are children.
Yeah, it's a huge proportion.
It's hard to overstate the immense logistical strain that puts on a society. If 40% of your country is legally too young to work, your entire economy is essentially a giant daycare system.
That's a really good way to put it.
I mean, every adult is carrying the financial weight of feeding, clothing, and educating a massive base of dependents, which leaves almost zero surplus capital for savings or business investment.
And that is the crucial constraint of a young population. Economists look at what is called the dependency ratio.
Right.
When that ratio is sky high, national wealth is entirely consumed by mere survival and basic child rearing. But the data shows a radical shift over time. By 2023, that youth bracket had dropped from 40.5% down to 30.2%.
That is a full 10 percentage point contraction.
Exactly. And what makes that drop so powerful is what is happening, or rather, what isn't happening, at the other end of the age spectrum.
Oh, right, because often when birth rates drop, the senior citizen population explodes. You just trade a child care crisis for an elder care crisis.
Right, but the data here shows the 65 and older population in Bolivia only crept up slightly. It went from 5.1% in 1960 to just 5.6% today.
Which triggers one of the most powerful, sought-after economic phenomena in the world.
The demographic dividend.
Yes, the demographic dividend. When the youth bracket shrinks and the senior bracket hasn't yet expanded, the vast majority of your population suddenly falls into the prime working age category.
And the economic impact of that is just enormous.
It's like a family where all 5 kids finally grew up, got their own jobs, and moved out, but the parents are only 50 and haven't retired yet.
Right, they're still earning.
Overnight, the household's disposable income skyrockets because they aren't buying diapers and school supplies anymore. The financial burden evaporates, and that money can finally be invested.
And at a national level, that investment potential is staggering. The government is no longer scrambling just to build enough primary schools to keep up with birth
They
rates.
can start directing capital toward infrastructure or higher education or healthcare.
Exactly. This demographic dividend creates a very rare, finite window of opportunity for hypergrowth.
But a working age population is only valuable if they have somewhere to work.
Right. And that leads to the second massive human shift in the report. They didn't just grow up, they physically relocated.
This is where the sheer logistics of the data boggled the mind. If you look at page 3, the geographic reshuffling is insane. In 1960, only 36.9% of Bolivians lived in urban areas.
The vast majority were scattered across rural agrarian communities.
Right. But fast forward to 2023, and that urban population has exploded to 71.2%. We are talking about 7 out of 10 people now living in cities.
And the growth rates outline the severity of this migration. For decades, the urban population was growing at a highly accelerated clip of 2 to 4% annually.
Wow, 2 to 4% every single year.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the rural population growth rate effectively flatlined, hovering near zero. People were just abandoning the countryside.
And the report specifically pinpoints the mid-1980s as the definitive inflection point where this urbanization trend went into overdrive.
It did, yeah. It synchronized with some major economic restructuring that we'll get into.
I want to push back a little on how we usually talk about urbanization because it sounds so sterile and academic. Think about the physical reality of what you just described.
It's a massive upheaval.
It really is. Think of this like a massive, sprawling corporation relocating from 100 tiny rural branch offices into one giant metropolitan headquarters.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. The potential for collaboration, specialized labor, and sheer economic efficiency skyrockets when everyone is in the same building. You can build one massive hospital instead of 50 tiny clinics.
But the infrastructure shock is immense. You have to build it all at once.
Exactly. Suddenly, the management has to build a ton of new infrastructure, desks, cafeterias, plumbing, electricity grids, all at once to handle the influx.
Right.
When millions of people pour into cities over a few decades, you aren't just building homes. You have to build sanitation systems, public transit, and power grids at breakneck speed.
And if the government fails to keep up, you don't get a shining modern metropolis.
Yeah.
You get sprawling, impoverished slums circling the city center.
And are they keeping up with that? That is the tightrope Bolivia has been walking, right?
It absolutely is. This gorgeous turnaround from an agricultural society to a highly concentrated urban one fundamentally rewires a nation's social and economic fabric. It alters family structures, voting blocks, and cultural identities.
But the most pressing question it creates is purely economic. If you have millions of working-age people abandoning their farms and flooding into the cities, what on earth are they doing for a living to survive?
Which transitions us perfectly into the macroeconomic data on pages 4 and 6. We have this massive new urban workforce. How is the broader economy actually handling them?
Well, the historical GDP data is, frankly, a terrifying roller coaster.
It really is.
If we look at the numbers, adjusted to constant 2015 US dollars to strip out the noise of inflation, the national GDP roughly doubled. It grew from $4.73 billion in 1960 to $43.7 billion in 2023.
A doubling of the economy is a massive expansion, but the trajectory was incredibly violent. You cannot look at Bolivia's economic history without stopping in the 1980s.
Right, the hyperinflation.
Exactly. The data from that decade shows extreme macroeconomic volatility, characterized by the severe trauma of hyperinflation. We are talking about consumer price index figures that didn't just rise, they went parabolic.
Inflation rates hit thousands of percent.
Yeah, the data series has these extreme fluctuation values right around 1985.
You know, it is incredibly difficult for anyone who hasn't lived through hyperinflation to grasp the absolute psychological destruction it causes.
It completely destabilizes a society.
It does. It's not just that bread gets more expensive. It means the paycheck you receive on Friday morning is practically worthless by Friday night. It means lifetime savings vanish in a matter of weeks.
Right. It destroys the foundational trust in the national currency.
And when that happens, all long-term business investment completely paralyzes. I mean, why would you build a factory if you don't know what money will be worth next Tuesday?
What's fascinating here is the mechanics of that hyperinflation. It's a brutal feedback loop. The government, usually facing massive deficits, starts printing money to pay its debts.
Which floods the market.
Exactly. It floods the market with currency, dropping its value, which makes goods cost more. Citizens panic and rush to spend their money the second they get it because holding on to it means losing wealth.
Right, the velocity of money just goes crazy.
Yes, that rapid spending increases the velocity of money, which drives prices up even faster. It requires brutal, deeply painful economic medicine to stop.
And the data indicates they did manage to administer that medicine. I mean, you don't double your GDP over the long run if your money remains worthless.
They did. Defeating that 1980s hyperinflation was the crucial foundation for everything else. Stopping it usually requires what economists call shock therapy.
Right, slashing spending.
Drastically slashing government spending, tightening the money supply, and essentially forcing the economy into a recession to kill the price spirals. It is agonizing for the working class in the short term.
But the report makes it clear that stabilizing the currency was a non-negotiable prerequisite. And looking at the recent deflator index data, over the last decade, their inflation has been tamed, sitting between a very healthy 2% and 5%.
Which is the gold standard target for central banks globally.
So because they survived the 80s and stabilized the ship, they were actually in a position to catch the wind when the 2000s rolled around.
Right, the post-2000 period brought high-speed economic growth.
And that was largely driven by a massive global boom in commodity prices, right? The world wanted raw materials, and Bolivia had them.
Yes, but here is where we have to look under the hood of that GDP growth. We know the economy doubled, and we know the cities are full of people. But what sectors are actually generating this wealth?
Let's look at page 5 for the sectoral breakdown because it is incredibly revealing. Today, services dominate the economy, accounting for roughly 53.3% of GDP. Industry, which includes construction, sits at about 31.3%. But manufacturing specifically, it is stuck at a dismal 13%.
And that is a huge problem.
Wait, let's look closer at that because that feels like a massive red flag. We just established that they have a huge demographic dividend, millions of young, working-age people living in cities.
Yes.
But if manufacturing has been flatlining between 10% and 13% for decades, that means these millions of urban workers aren't in factories. They aren't building cars or assembling electronics or weaving textiles.
No, they're overwhelmingly working in the service sector.
Doesn't that severely cap their economic ceiling? I mean, does that limit their industrial potential?
It doesn't just cap their ceiling, it exposes a critical vulnerability. It reveals a severe lack of momentum in industrialization. Economists refer to this as premature deindustrialization.
Right, because historically, nations like the US, the UK, or South Korea got rich by moving farmers into factories.
Exactly. Manufacturing creates millions of stable, middle-class jobs. It drives technological innovation, and it creates tangible goods that you can export to the world. Only after building that wealth do you transition into a service-heavy economy, like banking or software.
But Bolivia skipped the factory phase.
Of course, as I say, they went straight from the farm to the service sector. And in a developing nation, a service economy doesn't usually mean high-end tech consulting or finance.
What does it mean?
It often means informal labor, street vending, retail, local transportation, and low-wage hospitality. The report explicitly highlights the de-agriculturalization of the economy. It shows that agricultural output has been highly unstable.
So people left the farms because it was unstable.
Right, but the people leaving the farms didn't become industrial workers. They became service workers in an economy that produces very few finished goods. A service-heavy economy without a strong manufacturing base can be incredibly fragile.
Especially when we look at how they interact with the rest of the world. That structural reality forces a very obvious question.
Oh, absolutely.
If you have a massive urban population that is consuming modern goods, they are buying smartphones, wearing imported clothes, driving cars, but they aren't manufacturing any of those things themselves. How are they paying for it? Where is the actual money coming from to sustain this urban lifestyle?
That takes us directly to the borders, looking at page 7. The trade and export data paints a picture of a nation heavily reliant on the outside world. Total trade historically fluctuates wildly, making up anywhere between 40% and 80% of their entire GDP.
Wow. Up to 80%. So it is a highly outward-facing economy.
Very outward-facing.
But what exactly are they trading if they don't have a manufacturing base?
Dirt. Essentially raw earth. The vulnerability here is glaring. Their exports are overwhelmingly primary products, minerals, natural gas, and raw ores.
Just raw materials.
Right. During various periods covered by this dataset, primary raw materials accounted for over 90% of their total merchandise exports.
Let me visualize that. Over 90% of everything leaving the country on a truck or a train is just raw material that was dug out of the ground. No value added, no processing, just raw elements.
And the counter statistic is just as bleak. High-tech products make up a measly 4% to 9% of their already tiny manufacturing exports.
Wow.
They are not exporting innovation, they are exporting geology.
That is genuinely terrifying from a national security and economic stability standpoint. I mean, if 90% of your national income relies on what the global market is willing to pay for a ton of zinc or a barrel of natural gas, you have zero control over your own destiny.
You are a passenger on the global economic bus.
Exactly. If a recession hits Europe or Asia and demand for metals drops, the price crashes, and Bolivia's entire national revenue evaporates overnight.
You've hit on the defining danger of a commodity-dependent economy. It makes the entire national economy hypersensitive to external price shocks. When commodity prices drop, the whole country feels it immediately. When prices boom, the government is flush with cash. When prices bust, the government cannot fund its basic operations. This volatility is a massive hurdle to long-term planning.
So, if trade is that volatile, what happens during the bust years? How does a government keep the lights on when global metal prices tank?
That's on page 8. The data on external funds shows a really fascinating evolution in how they patch the holes in their economy.
Okay, let's look at that.
It's a story of two very different safety nets. In the 1980s and the 90s, the gap was primarily filled by official development assistance, or ODA.
So, foreign aid.
Right, direct foreign aid from developed nations, primarily the United States, Germany, Japan, and international institutions. During the tough decades, ODA was a major structural crutch that kept the capital flowing.
But the data shows that ODA has dropped significantly as a percentage of capital formation today. The net aid ratio really plummeted.
They have essentially weaned themselves off foreign government aid.
But they replaced it with something else, didn't they?
They replaced it with their own citizens. The data highlights a massive surge beginning in the mid-2000s in personal remittances.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is money sent back home by Bolivians who emigrated to work in countries with stronger economies. Today, those personal remittances remain a vital structural source of foreign exchange and household survival.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the macro numbers can obscure how risky this is.
Yeah, how so?
If you look at Bolivia like a personal investment portfolio, they're breaking the golden rule of diversification. They've put 90% of their money into one highly volatile stock, mining and fuel.
Right.
And when that stock inevitably crashes, they are relying on their kids sending money home, the remittances, to cover the difference. That feels incredibly risky. It's a survival tactic, not a long-term growth strategy.
That is a brilliant framing. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the risk concentration is immense. However, the data forces us to look beyond just how they made their money and examine what the government actively chose to spend that commodity wealth on during the good years.
Right, because they did have good years in the 2000s.
Exactly. Because despite this fragile economic engine, despite the lack of factories, the volatile trade, and the reliance on remittances, those spending choices resulted in an undeniable massive triumph in human welfare.
This is where the story pivots from structural anxiety to genuine awe. Because the social data from the last 2 decades is nothing short of an economic miracle.
It really is.
Let's look at page 9, focusing on poverty and the Gini coefficient. For anyone listening who isn't an economics major, the Gini coefficient is the global standard for measuring wealth inequality within a country.
Right. A score of 0 means perfect utopian equality.
Everyone has the exact same net worth. And a score of 100 means absolute dystopian inequality. One person holds all the wealth, and the rest of the country has 0. So the goal of any developing nation is to drive that number down.
And in the year 2000, Bolivia was facing a severe crisis of inequality. Their Gini coefficient was a sky-high 61.6.
A 61.6 is dangerously high. That isn't just an economic problem, that is a recipe for social collapse.
Absolutely.
When inequality reaches that level, it usually means a tiny, entrenched elite controls all the natural resources, while the vast majority of the population lives in grinding poverty with no upward mobility. It breeds massive political instability.
But look at the trajectory on the chart. By 2021, in just 2 decades, that Gini coefficient plummeted to 40.9.
Dropping a national Gini coefficient by over 20 points in 20 years is practically unheard of in modern economics.
It is a staggering achievement. This single data point makes Bolivia one of the most successful countries in the entire Latin American region at shrinking the wealth gap.
Wow.
It wasn't just economic growth, it was profound optimization of how wealth is distributed. The report specifically notes the shared prosperity indicator.
Huh.
The income of the bottom 40% of the population saw highly positive, sustained growth.
So how did they actually do it? Because wealth doesn't just trickle down organically, especially in a commodity economy where the mining profits usually stay at the very top.
They did it through aggressive, systemic optimization of resource distribution. We see this on pages 10 and 11. The government capitalized on the high commodity prices of the 2000s and actively redirected that wealth into human capital.
Right, the education data is amazing.
The data shows that education expenditure was consistently maintained at a massive 7% to 8% of the total GDP.
Committing 8% of your entire national output to education is a monumental policy choice.
It really is.
I mean, that is money that could have been spent on the military or tax cuts for the wealthy or vanity infrastructure projects. Instead, they poured it into classrooms.
And the return on that investment is crystal clear in the data. Compulsory education requirements were expanded drastically, jumping from 8 years of schooling to 14 years.
14 years of required schooling, that's huge.
But the most vital statistic is the youth literacy rate. For the 15 to 24-year-old demographic, literacy hit 99%.
A 99% literacy rate fundamentally changes the destiny of a nation. It means you have eradicated the darkness of illiteracy for an entire generation.
Exactly.
Every young person can now read a contract, follow a technical manual, and participate in a modern text-based society.
What's even more profoundly impactful is that the data shows full gender equality in that youth literacy rate. Young women are now just as literate as young men.
Which hasn't always been the case, right?
No. Historically, in agrarian societies, female education is often the first thing sacrificed when resources are tight. By achieving gender parity and literacy, they have essentially doubled their intellectual capital for the future.
So the demographic dividend we talked about earlier, that massive generation of young people, they aren't just young. They are fully literate and educated.
Right.
But what about their physical ability to contribute? How did this wealth redistribution impact public health?
The health metrics mirror the educational success beautifully. Female life expectancy, which is a great baseline indicator for overall societal health, leaped from 45.6 years in 1960 to 71.1 years in 2022.
Wait, adding 25 years to a population's life expectancy in a few decades is staggering. Let's ground that in reality. Adding 25 years means a mother doesn't just survive to see her children grow up. She survives to help raise her grandchildren.
Exactly. It completely changes the family structure.
It means a worker has 2.5 extra decades to earn a living, build household wealth, and pass it on to the next generation. It is a monumental victory for human dignity.
It is.
But the report also mentions maternal mortality is still a challenge. How do we reconcile 99% literacy and a 25-year life expectancy jump with lingering foundational health issues like mothers dying in childbirth?
That paradox reveals the exact threshold of development Bolivia is standing on right now. It highlights the vast difference between broad systemic investments and complex specialized care infrastructure.
Walk me through the mechanics of that difference.
Think about how you increase basic life expectancy. The data points out that immunization rates for diseases like measles and hepatitis B were pushed to and maintained at very high levels.
Okay.
Vaccination campaigns are logistically straightforward. You can send a trained nurse with a cooler full of vaccines on a motorbike to a rural village, and in one afternoon, you have drastically reduced child mortality for that entire community.
Right. It's a highly scalable, single-point intervention.
Exactly. The same goes for building a basic primary school to teach reading. It's a massive logistical effort, but it doesn't require complex daily maintenance.
But solving maternal mortality requires an entirely different universe of infrastructure.
Precisely. You cannot solve a complex childbirth complication with a single nurse on a motorbike. It requires a fully functioning, sterile hospital. It requires a reliable electricity grid to keep the lights on in the operating room.
A fully stocked blood bank.
Yes. A trained surgical team on call 24 hours a day, and paved reliable roads so an ambulance can get the mother to the hospital in time.
So what you are saying is that they have successfully conquered the easy problems, the basic foundational investments that yield massive statistical leaps. But now, to progress further, they are facing the hard problems.
Right. The complex, deeply integrated structural challenges.
And that transition from basic development to advanced complexity brings us to the present day. Because to take that final step and transition into a high-income, fully developed country, they have to solve complex social, environmental, and institutional problems.
Which is exactly what Section 5 of the report lays out, the unfinished business. Let's start with the gender dynamics on page 12.
Okay, because we just noted that young women are now 99% literate, achieving full parity with men.
Right. And the data shows massive gains in political representation, too. There have been significant increases in female parliamentary seats, and the legal indexes show that gender equality is improving institutionally.
So, on paper, women are claiming their space in the halls of power.
In politics, yes. But the data contrasts that political victory with the stubborn reality of the home. The Time Use surveys reveal that women still perform 23.1% of unpaid domestic work, compared to men who do only 12.1%.
That is a glaring structural barrier. Even though these women are fully educated, literate, and gaining political agency, they are still shackled to almost double the amount of unpaid labor.
Right. Cooking, cleaning, raising children.
If a woman is spending a quarter of her day doing unpaid manual labor, she cannot fully participate in the formal economy. That is a massive amount of national economic potential that is quite literally locked inside the house.
It is a cultural bottleneck that legal indexes alone cannot solve. And alongside that social challenge, we have to look at the environmental cost of their rapid urbanization on page 13.
Right, the climate data.
As millions moved to the cities and began consuming more modern energy, the carbon emissions steadily rose with industrialization. The energy consumption data shows a deep reliance on fossil fuels, which account for roughly 75% of their total energy mix.
While renewables are hovering around only 15%.
Correct. Which means they are powering this newly urbanized, modernizing society with the exact same volatile fossil fuels that they rely on for export revenue. It is an environmentally and economically precarious position.
Especially as global markets slowly begin to pivot toward green energy, and the report notes their disaster risk management scores show they really need to improve their capacity to handle climate change.
Yes, the carbon footprint is a growing pressure.
But even beyond the gender disparities and the environmental risks, the data identifies what seems to be the ultimate foundational bottleneck. Page 14, the one hurdle that affects every single other issue we've discussed.
The Worldwide Governance Indicators, or the WGI. This is the data set that measures the actual integrity, efficiency, and predictability of the state's institutions.
And stating the data clearly and maintaining total impartiality as we look at these numbers, the findings are incredibly sobering.
They really are.
Across multiple metrics, the control of corruption, the adherence to the rule of law, and overall government effectiveness, Bolivia frequently ranks in the bottom 20th percentile globally.
And the quality of their regulatory environment is shown to fluctuate heavily.
So what does this actually tell us?
It delivers the hard truth from the data. Institutional and legal development has fundamentally lagged behind their economic and social growth. Weak anti-corruption controls and a lagging rule of law are the primary obstacles preventing the country from transitioning to a high-income state.
Why does that happen, though? How can a government be organized enough to crash the Gini coefficient and build thousands of schools but fail at basic regulatory quality?
Because distributing commodity wealth is politically popular and relatively straightforward, building a robust, independent, transparent legal system requires those in power to willingly limit their own authority. It requires civil servants to reject bribes. It requires courts to enforce contracts fairly, regardless of political affiliation.
And without that, foreign companies won't invest.
Exactly. Foreign companies will not build high-tech manufacturing plants, the exact factories Bolivia desperately needs, if they don't trust the court system to protect their property rights, or if they have to navigate a maze of corruption just to get a permit.
So what does this all mean for the listener? To use a car analogy, it sounds like Bolivia spent the last 60 years upgrading their engine. Better education, longer lives, bigger GDP.
Right.
And because of that massive engine, they are driving incredibly fast right now. But they haven't upgraded the steering wheel or the brakes, the legal and governance institutions.
Yes, exactly.
If they hit a bump like a sudden drop in commodity prices and their steering is faulty, they don't just slow down, they might lose control of the vehicle entirely.
I agree entirely. This raises an important question. Can the country build these institutions fast enough to sustain their social miracles? because if the rule of law doesn't catch up to the economic engine, the growth will stall, and the games could be reversed.
Which brings us to the ultimate summary of this deep dive, looking at the conclusion on page 15.
Right.
The data leaves us with a crystal clear picture of both triumph and peril. Bolivia's achievements over the last 60 years are undeniably phenomenal. They managed rapid, massive geographic urbanization. They crashed extreme inequality to historic lows, redistributing wealth to the bottom 40%.
They built an entire generation of literate, educated youth.
And they added a quarter century to the average lifespan, yet their challenges are equally daunting.
Very daunting.
They suffer from an extreme over-reliance on dipping raw materials out of the dirt for export. They have a fragile, service-heavy urban economy that lacks manufacturing power. And overarching all of this is a severe governance bottleneck.
So the blueprint for their future, based on the core recommendations of the data, is straightforward but incredibly difficult to execute.
What are the three main recommendations?
First, they must diversify their exports away from primary raw materials. Second, they absolutely must strengthen the rule of law and deploy aggressive anti-corruption measures. And third, they need to continuously invest in higher education, moving past basic literacy.
It is a monumental task.
Yeah.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, a thread that ties this entire story together.
Yeah.
We talked about that demographic dividend at the very beginning, the massive, young, capable workforce. But demographic windows don't stay open forever. Eventually, that massive generation of young urban workers is going to age.
Right. They will need pensions and elder care.
Exactly. If Bolivia doesn't fix its governance and diversify its economy before this current generation grows old, what happens? They risk getting old before they get fully rich. It's a literal race against the demographic clock, and the next decade of institutional reform will entirely decide the winner. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope this leaves you pondering how data tells the vibrant, high-stakes story of human history.